We enter into the 5th and 6th year of the Corinthian War, between 390 and 389 BC. Now, after Iphicrates' victories near Corinth, no major land campaigns were conducted in that region. Also after this victory, an Argive army came to Corinth and amazingly seized the Acropolis, and this brought about the merger between Argos and Corinth. The border stones between Argos and Corinth were torn down, and the citizen bodies of these two great cities were merged. And this really was an unprecedented event in ancient Greek history. Now, Iphicrates left Corinth after the merger between Argos and Corinth. Apparently, Iphicrates had worn out his welcome after he killed some citizens from Argos. It isn't clear exactly what transpired here, but in any event, Iphicrates returned back to Athens with his peltus. Now, with the stalemate around Corinth, the war pushed north into Aetolia. This involved a town called Calydon. The Achaeans were in control of Calydon. The nearby Acarnanians were threatening Calydon with the assistance of Athens and Boeotia. With the real prospect of losing Calydon, the Achaeans decided to ask Sparta for help. The Achaeans threatened to leave the Peloponnesian League if Sparta failed to act. They even threatened to make peace with Athens. The Spartan assembly and ephors decided there was no choice but to enter into this little war. The problem was that if Sparta refused the Achaeans, their interests in the Corinthian Gulf would have been severely threatened. They had already lost Corinth up north. If they lost the Achaeans as an ally, they would have lost another ally on the Corinthian Gulf. And as we know, the Spartan navy had just recently reclaimed the Corinthian Gulf, so they certainly didn't want to lose control of the Gulf. From Sparta's standpoint, this really wouldn't expand the war any more than it already was, and just perhaps they could break up the alliance between the Acarnanians and their Greek allies. Agesilaus led the task force himself. Agesilaus gave the Acarnanians an ultimatum: break off their alliance with the Boeotians and Athenians, or he would proceed to lay waste to their lands. And he threatened to cut down all of their trees and kill all of their livestock. After he failed to receive a satisfactory response, Agesilaus kept good on his word and seized vast quantities of livestock and even captured slaves. To add insult to injury, the very next day he held a public sale for all of the booty that he had recently captured. This sale was taking place near a mountainside. The Acarnanian light infantry decided to launch a surprise attack and hurled down missiles from the edge of the mountain. They retired for the night, but the next day resumed their attacks on the Spartans. The Spartans attempted to gain the pass with the mountainside on their right and foothills on their left, but the Spartans were constantly harassed by the Acarnanians from above. Every time the Spartan heavy infantry gave chase, the Acarnanians would disappear into the mountains. The Acarnanians were inclined to keep to the mountains and avoided engaging the Spartans directly. Well, I can't blame them for that. After all, who would ever want to go into hand-to-hand combat with the Spartans? In any event, the mountains were simply too difficult for the heavy infantry and cavalry to navigate. The Spartans would simply have to force their way all the way to the top of the pass. After constant harassment, the Spartans finally made it to the top of the pass. Here they had the Acarnanians cornered, and so they formed up in battle formation. The light infantry of the Acarnanians still caused problems for the Spartans, until the Spartan infantry finally closed the gap. At that point, the Spartans got their pitched battle they so desired. The Spartans slaughtered 300 Acarnanians. The rest of the enemy fled. That was the last time the Acarnanians offered any serious resistance. Agesilaus set up a victory trophy and then continued on ravaging the countryside. Xenophon indicates Agesilaus was unable to capture any towns. Now here's my take on why no towns were captured. First, I don't think Agesilaus wanted to waste time on costly sieges, but he also undoubtedly wanted to make allies out of the Acarnanians. So if he destroyed all their cities, that's not going to make a very strong ally. And as we know, Sparta was in need of more friends, especially with all the Greek powers aligned against them. Agesilaus prepared to depart, but the Achaeans asked him to destroy the Acarnanians' fall harvest. Agesilaus paused and made a counterproposal. Let the enemy gather their harvest, and he would threaten their crops next summer. Agesilaus reasoned by then they would be unwilling to go another round with the Spartans and would sue for peace. And with that, Agesilaus returned to Sparta for the winter, bringing 390 BC to a close. In the early spring of 389, Agesilaus was ready to invade Acarnanian territory again. The Acarnanians caught wind of this and quickly dispatched emissaries to Sparta, and just as Agesilaus had predicted, made peace and joined the Spartan alliance. So now what was Sparta to do? Where was their vaunted army army to march. Sparta wanted to go after Athens and Boeotia, but that would have been dangerous while Argos remained in a warlike state against Sparta, especially since Argos bordered Sparta's own frontier. So Argos became the new prime target of the Spartans. Reduce it, and then the Spartans could perhaps go after Corinth or Athens. The Spartans were now led by Agesilaus, who had come of age. But first things first, Agesilaus visited the oracle of Delphi to receive permission from Apollo and Zeus. After he got the okay from Zeus, the Spartans advanced into Argive territory. Argos quickly sought a religious truce, but Agesilaus answered that the gods were not satisfied with their plea, and so he continued on into Argive territory. But then an earthquake occurred. Spartan officers believed it was time to retreat, but Agesilaus held the view that this was a sign from the gods, and furthermore it was a sign of the gods' approval. To ensure that there were no problems, Agesilaus made a sacrifice to Poseidon the next morning, and then continued on deeper into Argive territory. But the Argive army refused to meet the Spartans, and so eventually, after plundering the countryside, Agesilaus returned home and disbanded the army. This effectively was the last major land operation in Greece for the rest of the Corinthian War. The last years of the war between 390 and 387 BC were primarily fought at sea. Now we last left off in Asia Minor. Tiribaeus had been replaced by Struthos, who maintained an anti-Spartan policy. Thibron was sent to make war against Struthos, but he was killed in the process. Still, the Spartans decided to refocus their efforts on Asia Minor. They dispatched the Spartan general Diphyrtus with some vessels and ordered him to collect the remnants of Thibron's army. Here he would also raise new troops in Asia Minor from the cities still loyal to Sparta. And then he would make war against Struthos. Diphyrtus had quite a bit of success, and he even succeeded in capturing a huge prize, the son-in-law and daughter of Struthos. Diphyrtus was able to demand a ransom so large that he now could afford to pay a large amount of mercenaries to join the Spartan army. Meanwhile, some oligarchs from Rhodes arrived in Sparta. They warned that the Athenians were about to overrun Rhodes and were in the process of rebuilding their naval empire. The Spartans left it up to Oedicus to try and save the situation in Rhodes. Oedicus, though, was at a severe disadvantage since the Democrats in Rhodes possessed a fleet that was 2 times his size. Oedicus decided to do nothing, and just maybe the Spartans would relieve him and give someone else the impossible job of saving Rhodes. The Spartans obliged and placed Teleutius in command. Teleutius added some more ships to his fleet and set sail for Rhodes. On the way there, he defeated an Athenian squadron that was assisting a city that was in rebellion against Persia. Seems strange that the Athenians would help another city that was in rebellion against their Persian ally. And it was even stranger that it was the Spartan fleet, who was at war with Persia, that would stop the Athenians. Very, very bizarre indeed. In any event, Teleutius arrived in time to put new energy into the oligarchs at Rhodes, who of course favored Sparta. Well, now the Athenians were worried the Spartans just might be able to establish a new naval presence in the Aegean, just when Athens was starting to assert herself in the region. And so they dispatched the famed Athenian general Thrasybulus to the area with 40 ships. Thrasybulus decided Rhodes could wait since Teleutius and the oligarchs now held a strong position on the island. Despite this, the Athenians had far more resources in the region, and so Thrasybulus was in no hurry and set sail for the Hellespont. Here he hoped to make new allies for Athens, and he did just that, converting Byzantium to a democracy. City after city converted to democracy. These actions alone helped lay the framework for the Second Athenian Empire. And what that really brought in was more revenue and specifically more taxes. Next, Thrasybulus sailed for Lesbos and advanced against the Spartan interests on that island. The Spartan general on Lesbos organized an expedition but was defeated in battle and killed. Thrasybulus now was focused on Rhodes. On the way there, Thrasybulus stopped at Aspendus to collect some tributes. Some Athenian soldiers apparently decided that wasn't enough and raided some of the surrounding farmlands. In a rage, the local population revolted and entered Thrasybulus' tent and killed him on the spot. What a strange way for the great general to die, but his actions certainly greatly boosted Athens' prospects in the Aegean. Athens dispatched a new admiral to replace Thrasybulus and take command of the fleet. Meanwhile, the Spartans were anxious to reverse all of the gains that Thrasybulus had made in the Hellespont. In 389 BC, they dispatched a new general from Sparta. He achieved some success ravaging some of the Athenian possessions in the Hellespont and caused problems for Athenian merchant ships. The Athenians, fearing Sparta would undo the foundation laid for them by Thrasybulus, sent out Iphicrates with 8 vessels and his 1,200 peltas. When Iphicrates arrived in the Hellespont, he and the Spartan general carried on sort of a guerrilla war against each other. Soon Iphicrates received advanced intelligence that the Spartans were heading south in Asia Minor. Iphicrates decided to set up an ambush. Now apparently the Spartan general received word of the ambush, but for some strange reason chose to ignore the reports, believing them to be false. Well, as it turned out, they were true, and Iphicrates ambushed the entire Spartan formation. Several Spartans were killed, and many actually turned and fled, but they also were picked off by Iphicrates. That ended, at least for the moment, the Spartan resurgence in the Hellespont. Iphicrates returned back to his base in the Hellespont to continue bolstering Athenian interests in that region. Now, in 387 BC, the Persian satrap Tiribasis was again in power. This was a major turning point in the war, and really marked the movement towards a conclusion in this rather inconclusive war. You will remember Tiribasis was pro-Spartan, so Tiribasis worked together with the newly arrived Spartan general, Antalcidas. What Antalcidas was really pushing hard for was a peace between Sparta and Persia. This, he believed, would also see the end of the rebellious Greek states because it would cut off their all-important Persian funding. Antalcidas, with the help of Tiribasis, succeeded in convincing the Persian king Artaxerxes to formalize a treaty between Persia and Sparta. There is little doubt that the Persians were becoming more and more concerned about an Athenian resurgence, so it probably did not take much to convince the Persian king to break off from Athens and the Greek allies. With new funds available, the Spartan general Antalcidas and Tiribasis worked to rebuild a portion of the Spartan fleet in the Hellespont. Here they began to threaten Athenian naval interests in the region and even some lands close to Attica. That was enough to bring the Athenians and their allies to the negotiating table. Perhaps the Athenians had memories of 404 BC and didn't want to see their city wiped out. But also, how could the coalition conduct a war in Greece without all of that Persian gold? So finally, a comprehensive peace agreement was reached, and the Corinthian War came to an end in 387 BC. The Athenians were forced to give up many of their latest additions except for 3 islands. But the Athenians sort of circumvented this problem by making defensive alliances with several Greek islands in the Aegean. Now, also in terms of this peace treaty, the Greek city-states were to be independent. Now, at first glance, this was great. The Greek city-states could be independent. But on closer examination, it wasn't so great. Because the Greek cities were all independent, leagues such as the Theban-dominated Boeotian League were eliminated. So Sparta benefited greatly from this peace agreement because the Greek cities now had to be autonomous. So Thebes could no longer be the leader of the Boeotian League, and Corinth and Argos were now forced to break off their merger and were once again independent cities. Furthermore, Sparta was considered the guardian of this peace agreement, which they used as justification to interfere into the affairs of other Greek cities. So Thebes, Argos, and Corinth were now effectively isolated. So Sparta really achieved what they wanted, breaking up all of these leagues because of that independence clause in the peace agreement. But none of this, of course, applied to the Peloponnesian League. That league remained in full effect, since, well, at least according to Sparta, the independence clause didn't exactly apply to the Peloponnesian League. Therefore, Sparta felt fully obliged to straighten out anyone in the Peloponnesian League that had not been loyal during the Peloponnesian and Corinthian Wars. So Sparta was still effectively the de facto leader over Greece. But perhaps the greatest beneficiary of the peace agreement was Persia. Persia, of course, had started the Corinthian War by supplying gold to Thebes and other Greek city-states. And Persia's primary motivation was to get Sparta and Athens out of Asia Minor. A stipulation in the peace treaty gave all the Greek cities in Asia Minor to Persia. This effectively meant that Athens and Sparta would now have to remove all of their forces from the region. For the next 50 years, Persia would remain in possession of Asia Minor until Alexander's famed invasion. In the next video, we will deal with the events after the Corinthian War. See you guys then.